Even many people who call themselves creationists believe in millions of years.
But is the evidence for deep time really that rock solid? Today on Creation Magazine Live.
Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. My name's Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith.
Now, for many people, the age of the Earth the age of the universe is a settled issue.
Right.
The age of the Earth, this number 4.6 billion years, is thrown around as if it's a fact. And students have gained this understanding. They've been taught, perhaps, that a couple hundred years ago, scientists started discovering all of this evidence that the Earth is in fact 4.5 billion years old, and that everything that came before it is just it's pre-science.
Yeah, there's mounds of evidence, etc.
That's the idea.
Of course, most students aren't taught the history and the presuppositions behind this assumption, so they just accept it. Even many creationists believe that the Earth is millions of years old,
right,
and that they actually argue against biological evolution, while holding to the concept of geological evolution, or millions of years,
right,
because of the evidence, supposedly. But of course, the presuppositions behind the evidence for millions of years are the same presuppositions behind the concept of biological evolution.
Yes,
so
same types of things. Now, according to Wikipedia, this is Wikipedia, the primary evidence for the age of the Earth comes from radioisotope dating.
Right.
That's the #1 evidence. And we've dealt with this many different times. You can see the links to the shows we've done on the screen. We've done a couple of shows there, and there's others, of course, on creation.com as well.
Yeah.
So we need to mention that Wikipedia is not like the Encyclopedia Britannica or something. Okay, this is a user-edited encyclopedia,
right,
but nevertheless, it's probably one of the first places that people go to nowadays to get information on things.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Popular.
Interesting to see on their article that the first thing they mention is this article is about the scientific age for the Earth, and for religious beliefs, see dating creation, right? That the typical evolution is science and creation is religious type nonsense that we've dealt with so often on the show. But of course, if you look up a definition of religion on dictionary.com, for example, you'll see a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe, especially when considered as the creation of a superhuman agency or agencies. If you take away the creator part, which is what secularists want to do, it basically says a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe. So guess what? Everybody has a religious beliefs, because even atheists believe they know what the cause and et cetera of the universe is.
Sure, yeah, everybody's equally religious.
Yeah.
Now, although the Wikipedia article touts radioisotope dating as really their big guns as far as the evidence for millions of years, billions of years is concerned, the fact is that 200 years ago, when scientists started looking at, pondering the age of the Earth and serious, radioisotope dating didn't exist.
Right.
It wasn't around 200 years ago. The argument back then that was used was very, very different, of course. And there were two major views used to argue then, with subsets of belief within those two views.
Right. There were the gradualists, like Charles Lyell, for example. These men were arguing for gradual processes to account for what they saw in geology.
Right.
And then the flip side were catastrophists, like George Cuvier and William Buckland. And these were more likely to believe in sudden events or catastrophes to explain much of what they saw in the rocks. And note, by the way, that not all catastrophists believed in a young Earth. Many were catastrophists that believed in old Earth, but saw catastrophes as a way to explain things.
Right. Now note something here. Both were looking at exactly the same data.
Right.
They're looking at the rocks and so on. Here we see again the difference between operational and historical science, that it seems like we do this to death, but people still don't get it. There's differences in this area.
Yeah.
No one can go back in time and see these geological features form.
Right.
So we're talking about things that are not observed. and then you interpret those facts based on what history you believe to be true.
That's right. So they're both looking at the same facts. They're both coming to completely different conclusions.
Right.
And oftentimes they still both believe in millions of years that they're coming to different conclusions, etc. So back then there were three main evidences used to, that the gradualists, old Earth advocates, used to bolster their beliefs in an old Earth, millions of years processes.
Okay.
They were the time needed to erode valleys, 2, volcanism, volcanoes, and 3, the time needed to form sedimentary rocks. We've already shown the serious problems with radiometric dating and things like that. What we want to do on this show is go back to the beginning of this concept of millions of years, the popular notion of millions of years, and see how those arguments that they used back then stack up based on what we know today about science.
Over 3 chapters, the book of Genesis vividly describes a worldwide flood that began with all the fountains of the great deep bursting forth and the floodgates of heaven being opened. The reality of Noah's flood is the crux of the conflict between evolutionary and biblical worldviews. If this global deluge really happened, then the millions of years of Earth history and evolutionary progression supposedly seen in the fossil record are swept away. The flood accounts for the major geological features and the vast majority of the fossil record. Indeed, the fossils themselves are a mute testimony to the truth of the flood. We find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the Earth. Just what you would expect from the biblical account. If Christians were to believe and effectively defend the biblical account of the flood, then the basis for the evolutionary worldview would largely collapse. Many people would be saved from such a great pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
So if you're just tuned in, today we're talking about, is the evidence for deep time really that solid?
Right, yeah. So argument 1 used by old Earth geologists in the 17 and 1800s was the time needed to erode valleys. Gradualists were arguing for slow erosion over long periods, obviously, similar to how it's actually still used to explain Grand Canyon, that the Colorado River slowly carved the canyon. Catastrophists, on the other hand, were arguing for events like mega tsunamis to explain the valleys happening quickly. Now, both schools failed to provide a comprehensive explanation because there was not one causal mechanism for valleys. Right. Dr. M.J.S. Ruddick, one of the foremost historians of geology, describes the problem this way. A case that belonged more specifically to physical geology was the vexed question of the causal origin of valleys. Valleys were observed to be of many forms. A few could plausibly be attributed to the erosion by streams that flowed in them, but most could not.
Right. Geologists noticed that there was a tremendous variation in size, configuration, the elevation, different settings for valleys, but a specific problem was the difference between U-shaped valleys and V-shaped valleys.
Right.
There was a gradual explanation for V-shaped valleys, but not for U-shaped ones. Now, by 1850, glacial erosion was widely accepted as the mechanism for U-shaped valley erosion. And of course, this would take place over many years, but not necessarily over millions of years. However, the paradigm of gradualism had been so thoroughly integrated into geology by this time that the idea of one unique ice age, which is what creationists would believe, of course,
right,
was changed to be simply one of many ice ages, probably caused by global climate change over millions and millions of years.
Yeah, the main argument from the gradualists included the rate of erosion seen in modern streams. You look at a stream and they saw how fast it eroded, and that was their argument. Since most streams are much smaller than the valleys you find them in, an assumption of constant rates demanded a long time.
Right.
That's where you get the long ages. But of course, energetic currents erode more quickly, as modern examples of flooding have shown. For example, Burlingame Canyon in Walla Walla, Washington is a small-scale analogy, or can be used as an analogy, to Grand Canyon, which was observed, this canyon was observed to have formed in less than 6 days. Right. It measures 450 meters long, up to 35 meters deep, and again as wide, winding through a hillside. And in March 1992, of course, Mount St. Helens, there was a mud flow there, a pyroclastic flow that carved a canyon called Little Grand Canyon.
Right.
And it was what was a mud flow actually? It was carved in a single day. So if you have higher flows, they can erode canyons there quite clearly.
Right, it doesn't take time. It takes, yeah. Another old age proof was Jean-Louis Soulevy's estimate of thousands of years to round pebbles. And of course the inference that the rest of the valley features, well, that would have taken far longer than even that. Of course, this is falsified by observations at the island Surtsey.
Yes.
We've talked about this before. Formed in 1963. By 1965, National Geographic was saying things like this: boulders on Iceland's Surtsey Island may look old, but they're actually as young as the island itself, which was born after volcanic eruptions on November 14th, 1963. Of course,
so 2 years old, and it had rounded boulders on the shore.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, you can just get a stone tumbling machine that can do that. They'll take precious stones and put it in, and they round it out and stuff. So,
yeah, a good maximum to remember is either it takes a little water over a little water in a long time, or a lot of water in a short time.
Right.
It's one or the other. But we've seen canyons and valleys. Erode slowly with just a little water. But whenever scientific observations are made, it's always a lot of water in a short time.
Right.
That's what we've seen.
We haven't seen it the other way around.
We haven't seen it the other way around. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Richard Van Grad and Calvin Smith also host a fast-paced and informal internet-based video program called Genesis Unleashed. These faith-building teaching videos feature responses to news articles, summaries of articles on creation.com, interviews, and answers to some of the most asked questions about the creation-evolution issue and the most attacked book of the Bible, Genesis. Visit creation.com's media center to view or subscribe to the latest video content.
This week we're talking about the evidence for deep time. Is it really that solid? That's what we're talking about.
So the second argument that used by old Earth geologists, the gradualists in the 17th and 1800s, was volcanism, volcanoes.
Right.
18th century geologists argued that the biblical timescale was untenable because more time was needed to produce volcanoes than the Bible allowed. Of course, the argument was simple. Geologists of the day compared the volume of observed eruptions to the size of large volcanoes, because composite volcanoes, they're formed gradually by cooled lava and ash that's emitted from them. And so as each episode adds more and more mass, the bigger the volcano got, the older they assumed it was. For example, Mount Etna reaches 3,350 meters. They estimated the amount of mass ejected from certain volcanoes, and they divided by how long between the episodes they determined there were. And then they concluded that the volcanoes must be much older than the biblical time.
You get an age, yeah,
right.
Yeah, that way.
Now, here's a quote. Although the eruptions of Etna and Vesuvius were irregular and notoriously unpredictable, the records did give savants a rough sense of the rate at which those great volcanic cones might have accumulated, and hence of their overall age.
Now the thing is, observations of modern volcanoes argue against those conclusions, against their conclusions. The most common argument for time was based on the scale of flows they observed. Well, a few eruptions from Mount Vesuvius and Mount Etna, that's what they observed.
Right.
Modern eruptions and flows demonstrate great variety in the strength of eruptions and the amount of material produced. A common scale is used to compare the eruptions from these volcanoes. It's the Volcanic Explosivity Index. Kind of a cool name. It ranges from 0 to 8. It uses ejected volume, chemistry, duration, and the height of the column into the atmosphere. And as an example, the 79 AD eruption of Mount Vesuvius rated a 5, and the 1815 Mount Tambora eruption a 7.
Right, so they rate the intensity of these episodes. Here's a chart showing what secular scientists have concluded each volcano ejected over an evolutionary timescale. We don't believe these timescales, but anyway, what we observe is that the further in time one goes back, the larger the events were. And of course, this fits the biblical timescale very well, as we would think at the time of the Great Flood, when the fountains of the Great Deep ripped open, the earth plates were moving, there would have been a lot of tectonic activity.
Sure.
And of course, that would have gradually settled down over time. So there's been plenty of time to account for the accumulation of the volcanic mass during the biblical timescale.
Right. So not only were these geologists wrong about the magnitude of modern eruptions, that's clearly an error, right. But they hadn't studied a sufficient number of historical examples.
Right.
To learn that ancient eruptions were often much larger than modern ones. This is perfectly consistent with biblical history, as you just said. We would expect larger eruptions going back into the past.
Right. They often consider themselves well-traveled, but well-traveled meant well-traveled in Europe.
Yeah.
In certain places. Now, the third argument used by older geologists, the gradualists in the 1700s and 1800s, was the time needed to form sedimentary rock. Most geologists in the 1800s accepted a standard basic model for that day for Earth history, and it's summarized here. Geotheories based on falling global sea level were so general that they will be grouped together here and termed the standard model of the Earth's temporal development. So these people most of them believed in rising and falling sea levels, explaining the rock layers, etc. Most of them were highly opposed to the concept of a global flood, because that would have been a catastrophe. By this time, gradualism had taken over preeminently, and so they proposed actually several objections to the biblical flood, and we'll go over them when we get back.
Dinosaur fossils are often found in an unusual posture characterized by their head thrown back, hind limbs bent, and tails extended. Over the years, scientists have proposed different theories to explain this puzzling phenomenon. However, according to paleontologist Cynthia Marshall-Foe, there is only one legitimate explanation, which is that the dinosaurs died of asphyxiation. It is well known that animals, starved of oxygen when they die, can go into this characteristic posture due to muscle spasms. This new understanding of dinosaur fossilization fits well with the Bible's account of history, where most dinosaurs were rapidly buried in sediment during the global flood. Starved of oxygen in their last moments, many dinosaurs assumed this unique asphyxiation posture. So the biblical flood provides a simple solution to a long-held dinosaur mystery.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
We're talking today on Creation Magazine Live about evidence for deep time. Is it really that solid?
Right.
Now, early old Earth proponents made a dual argument against a global flood in geology. And so they argued for millions of years. These are the two things they said against a global flood. They said the sheer volume of sediment, the sedimentary rock, could not possibly have been laid down in a year, the year-long flood. And argument number two, the internal features within those sedimentary rocks, fine layers, for example, a flood could not produce things like that. Those were the two main arguments there.
These are actually the same two main arguments that are used today against the global flood.
Yep.
So let's tackle the first one first here. To do so, what we're going to do is, one, we're going to determine the total volume of sedimentary rocks in the Earth's crust. Two, determine the surface area over which these rocks were deposited. Then three, we can derive an average thickness of the sedimentary rocks over that area. And then, of course, four, we can compare that estimate to the potential flood depositional rates. How much would the flood have had to accumulate at a time let's say, per day to do that? So geologists have actually calculated the actual average thickness of the sedimentary rocks on the continents is about 1,800 meters thick. That means the daily flood average would only be a mere 4.85 meters per day. And so about 16 feet of sediments per day. Seeing as how we've observed deposition of sediments at rates like this in catastrophic conditions today, we think this is an extremely reasonable proposition. As a matter of fact, secular geologists themselves require deposition rates like this to explain certain data like polystrate trees that go through several layers. For example, Derek Ager, who's an anti-creationist geologist, admits that slow deposition wouldn't work to explain certain facts that we observe. For example, he said, if one estimates the total thickness of the British coal measures at about 1,000 meters, laid down in about 10 million years, then assuming a constant rate of sedimentation, it would have taken 100,000 years to bury a tree 10 meters high, which is ridiculous, and we would agree.
Yes, obviously, yeah. Now let's take some time and look at the second argument, some of the internal features of the rock which secular geologists say invalidate the flood. Well, for many decades, Geologists believe that bedding, especially fine lamination, fine little layers, millimeters thick, for example, required long periods of time in tranquil conditions, like the bottom of a lake or something like that. And then these layers would build up 1 or 2 a year. However, recent research and field examples show that doesn't always need to be that way. For example, Guy Berthaud in France, he has shown that particles with different sizes, masses, and densities, they behave differently in moving water, and they will form fine layers when deposited in moving water. Some incredible things there. You can look at more information on that. Go to creation.com/SEDEXP, sedimentation experiments is where you're going there. He found some amazing things there. Fine layers form quickly.
That's right.
Yep.
Of course, the fine laminated rocks at Mount St. Helens formed a pyroclastic flow from the eruption. This has shown finely laminated rocks can appear in hours, right?
Yeah, amazing things. In fact, millimeter thick laminae have been traced for 114 kilometers. For example, the Castile Formation in West Texas that suggest large-scale, unusual processes which a global flood would actually explain quite easily.
Exactly. Cementation and fossilization. Those are processes claimed to require long periods of time,
right.
Much more than a flood year, for example. But these processes can occur rapidly under the right conditions, which are lots of water and lots of minerals. And for example, the fossilization of a miner's hat, a felt hat found in a mine in Tasmania. It had been covered in water for just a little more than 50 years, and it's rock solid. So it doesn't take that long to make a fossil or cementation.
It evolved from a soft hat to a hard hat.
That's right. Yeah.
A common joke among CMI speakers. Stalactites and stalagmites, right? You go into a cave tour today, and all these things take a very long period of time.
Right.
That's what's commonly thought. But some of these stalactites and stalagmites, 10 feet tall, 4 or 5 inches in diameter, have been seen to grow in just 20 years. Sizable stalagmites and stalactites.
That's right.
So, amazing. Numerous minerals act as cement in the rock record. When the chemical environment meets certain parameters, the cements bind to the edges of the grains, often with bonds stronger than the grains themselves. The thing is, cement can make up a significant percentage of a rock body.
That's right. Although some geologists claim that cementation is a problem for flood geology, it's actually worse for them.
Yes.
For example, a secular geologist, F.J. Pettijohn, noted a cemented sandstone stratum 100 meters thick, for example, contains within it enough cementing material to form a layer 25 to 30 meters thick if these minerals weren't segregated. So where did all this cement come from? How is it all evenly distributed and mixed together if it wasn't a worldwide flood? So see, the thing is, logic demands that a conclusion be abandoned if its original evidence is unsound. The original evidence for millions of years is completely unsound,
yes.
And yet today they use other methods to try to bolster it. Now, we've got a book here called Rock Solid Answers, and this answers questions about caves, fossil preservation, dinosaur tracks, all of these supposed challenges to flood geology.
Right. Yeah.
And just in a fantastic format, great format. And if you'd like to order this book to get more information about what we've covered here today, you can just use the code CMLRSA, and that'll get you 30% off this book no matter where you're ordering from. So I encourage you to check that out and get more information on the topic we're covering today.
Creation Ministries International edifies the body of Christ by providing more than 30 years of Bible-supporting scientific research, delivered through speaking engagements, books, magazines, and a variety of media, much of which is archived on our website, creation.com. Did you know that if you read 3 articles on creation.com each day, it would take over 7 years to read them all? Such a wealth of information didn't arise by chance, however. We do this through the faithful prayers and gifts of our supporters, which also fund ongoing research. Support the building up of the church by partnering with CMI. Donate today at creation.com/donate.
Welcome back. As we wrap things up here, we're talking about deep time and so on. Now we'll talk about a feedback.
Yeah.
We often get feedback, people writing into our website and asking questions, and sometimes they're not asking questions, but they're making comments, some of which are quite interesting. But here's one from Timothy of the UK. In his letter, he wrote about Newton, Isaac Newton, greatest scientist who ever lived, and he's saying, well, Newton was a creationist only because that's the only option that he had. He said this: "It does not seem to be an entirely legitimate strategy to claim that scientists such as Newton as creationists and therefore not evolutionists, when in many instances those cited would have been long dead before the rise of evolutionary theory. It is probably indisputable that such individuals would have believed the literal truth of biblical creation. But there is obviously no way of knowing whether or not they would have rejected such beliefs in light of Darwinian theory." That's his letter.
Right, and so Dr. Jonathan Sarfati comes back and he said this, here's the line he's talking about: "It does not seem to be an entirely legitimate strategy to claim scientists such as Newton as creationists." And Jonathan said, "Oh yes, it is. Common canards of evolutionary zealots are that you can't be real scientists if you are not an evolutionist, and that science is impossible without evolution. That there were people who were by definite choice creationists, not just by reason of their social surroundings and milieu, and who were the founders of a significant fields of science, gives the lie to these propaganda claims." I mean, the whole reason why this person wrote in is, you know, the common thing is, well, you creationists aren't real scientists. And we point out, well, the greatest scientists on the planet were creationists.
Right.
So they're trying to downgrade this, of course.
Another point Timothy made here was that, well, evolutionary theory hadn't come up yet by the time of Newton. And Jono responds this way. That's Jonathan Sarfati,
yes,
for those not. He says, "Not so. Evolutionary ideas were not invented by Darwin. Some of the ancient philosophers before Christ, such as Anaximander in 546, Epidemodus."
These people had funny names.
There's funny names.
Empedocles.
There's a whole bunch of guys here.
Demetrius,
who all
Epicurus,
lived,
Lucretius.
Lucretius, yeah, we can get that one. They had evolutionary ideas that arose that had to do with like spontaneous generation and so on, more like that. But those were evolutionary ideas that did not involve a creator. Evolutionary ideas were around long before Darwin.
Well, that's the thing. To be an atheist, you have to believe in evolution. So there have been atheists all throughout our history, and so if you believe, you're an atheist, how'd you get here? Through some form of evolution. Yeah. One final point: it's probably indisputable that such individuals would have believed in the literal truth of biblical creation, but there's obviously no way of knowing whether or not they would have rejected such beliefs in light of Darwinian theory. And Jonathan said exactly. So we can only cite what they actually believed, and leave it up to the evolutionists to assert that they would have changed their minds had they known about Darwin.
Awesome. Yeah, Newton was a great creationist. You know what? Get your copy of Free Creation Magazine. This is Creation Magazine Live. Calvin and I get a lot of the content for this show from Creation Magazine, the back issues of Creation Magazine. Right. You can get a free copy. Go to creation.com/freemag, and you can look at a sample copy of Creation Magazine Live. Get yourself signed up for a subscription as well if you like that. And we'll see you next week.